You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 12th of November, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Europe struggles to balance criticism of Israel's government while avoiding anti-Semitism. Incumbents struggle to win over voters across the world. And our most popular tourist destinations struggle with how to keep the masses away. I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests, Terry Stiatsny and Philippe Marlière, will discuss the day's big stories and we'll check in with the latest offerings from two curators at Turin Art Week. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, and I'm Chris Chermak. I'm joined today by Terry Stiatsny, political journalist and author, and by Philippe Marlière, professor of French and European politics at University College London. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello there.
I was going to start with, I suppose, because it is 1 week since the US election, and I did this yesterday as well, but I'll ask you in turn, where were you 1 week ago, and what was the mood where you were? Terry?
I was just at home, so the mood was fairly subdued and quiet. And I was sort of weighing up. Shall I stay up all night? Am I going to watch all of it? And I stayed up until about sort of 11:30 UK time, thinking I'll watch the exit polls. And the exit polls didn't give us much clue because they weren't sort of who did you actually vote for. The American exit polls are like what was really important to you when you cast your vote. And I did have a sort of a qualm when I saw how many people had said the economy was really the most important issue for me. And I went to bed thinking, oh, well, there's no point staying up. I'll wait and see what happens in the morning, and then got up first thing. And I think there was probably a howl as I switched the radio on that could have been heard through the house.
Philippe, you've already had one election this year where I'm sure you stayed up late or like following the French results. But what were you doing for the US election?
Well, the difference with the French result is you get
it comes a bit earlier,
8
to be fair. Yes.
You've got exit polls which are quite reliable in general. So that makes a big difference. But the same for me. I was in front of my TV in London and I stayed up a bit later until 1:30 in the morning, London time. And I think, while checking one last time my iPhone before going to bed, I think some of the states which were in contention and which Harris could have possibly won were not won by her. So I thought it's really a bad start for her. The omens were not very good when I went to bed.
Well, we will talk a little more about the US later in the show, but we'll start with Israel and Israelis under attack in Europe, because as the wars in Gaza and Lebanon continue, the fight was taken to the streets of Amsterdam this weekend in an ugly escalation with supporters of the Israeli football team, Maccabi Tel Aviv. While the exact circumstances remain a bit unclear, the violence has revived concerns about anti-Semitism in Europe and tested the continent's delicate balancing act, as many European governments have sharply criticized the Israeli government for its handling of the war in Gaza and are preparing to deal also with an incoming Trump administration likely to give Israel even more leeway in the conflict. Terry, as I said, the circumstances in Amsterdam, some of the what the sort of football players were doing or football supporters of the football team were doing versus the protesters, a bit unclear, but nonetheless no excuse for any of this.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that's what the Dutch Prime Minister was saying. He said, that there might have been some kind of incitement's the wrong word, but some trouble with the Maccabi supporters. But Dick Schoof said that the actions against them, the attacks on them, were completely of a different character, and there was no excuse for the level of violence, and also what seems to have been organised violence against the Israeli supporters, which was just totally out of any proportion to any offence that people might have taken, and really quite scary scenes, and generally a big worry for cities across Europe.
Philippe, what did you make of this? The fact that there is this kind of violence now coming to the streets, this effort to also balance the many protests that are happening against Israel by pro-Palestinian groups in parts of Europe and in Amsterdam, but again, to this point, it cannot escalate into this kind of violence against actual Israelis.
I fully agree with that. I agree with Terry. I think it's unacceptable. Nothing can justify the violence, the assault, the aggression against Israeli supporters and Jews, because at some point I think it seems that people in Amsterdam were looking for Jewish people and sort of a broader sense than it's not simply Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters. I think it's worrying. I think anti-Semitism has been on the rise in the world and notably across Europe for some time. And I think you've got a kind of discourse on the level of government, which of course condemns that, but very little is done on the ground. Very little is done in, I think, also possibly in the media, and I'm afraid also in anti-racist associations. Parties on the left, which should be concerned about racism, some of them are in denial. I'm thinking here of a situation I know well in France, notably. I think there's a complete denial. And so, yes, it is very... we shouldn't export a very complex conflict, a very difficult situation taking place in Gaza. And justify, as I saw it, particularly on the social media, people justifying the violence against Israelis on the grounds that they support so-called genocidal regime. This said, I have to make a last point. The behavior of Maccabi Tel Aviv fans was, in my view, ultras in football are not very clever. They behave in a very stupid manner, very macho. But here it was really beyond the pale, because they not only chanted racist, anti-Arabic and racist slogans, but also they disrupted a minute of silence in the name of the victims of the floods in Valencia. They behaved very appallingly. But again, that doesn't in the least justify what happened.
Terry, are we in danger, I guess, of mixing politics and anti-Semitism? Is that part of the problem here? Because what have you made, I guess, of governments who do have a right and are many criticizing Israel's government for what it is doing in Gaza and in Lebanon? How do they sort of square that circle of criticizing the government, but to what extent do they have to, at the same time, I suppose, emphasize that this is not something that is speaking out against, obviously, Jews or Israeli society?
I think that is, it's the key thing. And I think we managed to do it, a lot better with most other countries or many other countries than we do with Israel. It's perfectly legitimate, obviously, to criticize the policies of the Israeli government. And plenty of Israelis are doing that at the moment. And plenty of them are protesting against their own government. But the danger is when you, conflate that with attacks on either Israeli citizens or going further and, attacks or anti-Semitism against Jewish people, then that's obviously, completely unjustified. And, I think you've seen in London in the last year, there have been quite a few Jewish people saying that they don't feel particularly safe in central London, particularly when there are pro-Palestinian protests going on. And again, of course, people have got the right to demonstrate and, express their political views, but everybody in a democratic society should be able to feel safe in expressing those views and not threatened just because of who they are.
Philippe, what have you made of France and Emmanuel Macron's approach in particular? Because he has been one of the more outspoken leaders when it comes to criticizing Bibi Netanyahu and Israel's prime minister. He's gotten into quite a few diplomatic tiffs with the prime minister. What have you made of the balance he's trying to strike?
It's very interesting because that probably signals a change of mood on level of governments in Europe. I think they, started off from a position of unconditional support following the 7th of October atrocities committed by Hamas in Israel. And of course, now more than 1 year into that retaliation and war waged against Gazan people. And there's a sense that not only it's going too far, because it's now making the whole place inhabitable and it's with lots of casualties, civilian population. So there's a sense of things are not right, out of proportion. But also it's the lack of regard on the part of the Israeli government for international laws. And Macron is very clear that Israel should abide by UN Charter. And I think he even made a comment the other day saying, well, Israel shouldn't forget that it was created as a state following a decision by the UN. And
a comment which itself was sort of became a debate and somewhat taken out of context.
Yes.
Was Israel created by the UN as opposed to
yes,
war?
of course, it's not entirely the UN's creation, and of course, it's a bit more complex than that. But I think yes, thanks to the support of the UN at the time, or at least the majority of members of the UN, Israel could be created at the time. So I think it's very interesting. You see also other heads of government, such as Pedro Sanchez, Prime Minister of Spain, who was also even more vocal than Macron. And I think probably it would be interesting to look at who are still the European governments unconditionally supporting Israel. I think probably Germany would be the last one. So I think there's lots of reservations, gone too far for too long. Too many civilians have been killed. And of course, now there's a new front open in South Lebanon, which is also a major concern for European governments.
Terry, just very quickly before we move on, what about Keir Starmer? Because I'm just curious. He, of course, had to root out anti-Semitism in the Labour Party famously before the war in Gaza. Do you think that impacted his own approach now?
Yes, I mean, I think that was a really important thing for Keir Starmer in showing that the Labour Party had changed and actually saying, no, I am going to completely change our policy. And he has been moving, I think, in parallel with other, international leaders to say we don't want, limited arms sales to Israel, for instance. But I think, Keir Starmer, he's quite a cautious politician generally. And I think he's not going to make more outspoken criticisms, even if he is pushed a bit towards it by some more on the left of his party, but he has been very clear to stay sort of working internationally and not really going further than other leaders around him are prepared to do.
Well, speaking of Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, the two leaders met in Paris this week as part of Armistice Day, but no doubt the biggest topic on their agenda will have been the election of Donald Trump in the United States. Not only because of how Trump will approach foreign policy, but because of what his victory might say about their own electorates. Macron, of course, recently fended off a challenge from Marine Le Pen's party in parliamentary elections, but she'll get another chance in presidential elections in just a couple of years. And Keir Starmer has only just won an election in the UK, but nonetheless will have to contend with an emboldened Nigel Farage, a fierce proponent of Trump, on his right flank. Philippe, Macron last time around really tried to charm Donald Trump, shall we say. We remember the handshakes, the Bastille Day celebrations. Do you think he's going to try the same kind of approach again?
He was very quick to congratulate Trump this time around, and that was sort of, he was criticized even in France for it being too prompt. I think within, I wouldn't say minutes, but hours for sure. He was one of the first statesmen to congratulate Trump. I think it's, when you're a head of a state, I think it's fair enough that you should establish contact with whoever wins an election, even if you personally dislike him. But I think personal dislikes should be set aside when you're head of government or head of state. I think, yes, he's going to probably try to concentrate on that because they are very big dossiers, really concerning, world affairs. Notably, I'm sure when he met with Keir Starmer this week in Paris, or yesterday, in fact, they discussed Ukraine. I think that's the number one issue for Europeans because we do not know exactly what Trump is going to do. Is he going to carry on the Biden administration's policies of, supporting Ukraine, arming Ukraine? It's not sure. So if that's not the case, what happens? Can we let Putin's Russia win the war? And it's a major worry. And I think there could be, out of a very bad, possibly disastrous situation, there could be some good coming out of it, which would be Europe, and I mean the EU plus the UK, could seriously, at last, discuss European defence and give itself the means to have a proper defence and not rely entirely on NATO, which so far has meant relying largely on US forces. And so I know it will be costly, but we live in a very dangerous world. So I think that's probably a serious discussion to be had with other European partners.
And Terry, Keir Starmer has had the awkward start, I suppose, to this relationship of his party being accused of election interference while the election was going on. Do we imagine that is something that Donald Trump will have forgotten?
I think, Trump is clearly someone who bears a grudge and somebody who takes things personally. But I think in the grand scheme of things, whether a few people from the Labour Party went to help a campaign that lost is not going to be the biggest issue. When you're having arguments about Ukraine and Gaza and climate change and everything else, I think, you might chuck in the odd thing about, and your people were helping, my opponents. But I think, they've going to have far bigger fish to fry, I think, than that particular thing. And I think, Keir Starmer and David Lammy have been trying to make a lot of, we've got good working relationships with Trump and with his people and working through the embassy quite a lot in Washington to try and say, look, we can manage this.
Well, just to follow that up, Terry, I mean, then when it comes to the issues, are there things that you're seeing from these initial approaches where the UK and the US can work together? Are you seeing areas where Starmer might try to have some influence over Donald Trump? Because they are of different parties, obviously, but at the same time, at least in the past, in history, the UK-US special relationship, UK prime ministers always try to have a certain amount of influence over their US counterparts.
Yes, I mean, I think there are clearly some issues where, Britain is trying to say, look, we're going to increase our defence spending. We can't promise you exactly when we're going to do it, but we will increase our proportion of defence spending, which is obviously something that Trump has criticised NATO members in the past. And I think it will be interesting to see what kind of line Britain treads in terms of tariffs, because there are obviously industries that they want to protect. They want to say, well, look, we're not in the EU. If you're going to pick a trade war with the rest of Europe, you don't necessarily need to be picking one with us. But still, UK exports and the US is the biggest destination for UK exports could still be huge and could still be impacted, and they will be worried about growth. But I think, it's quite important that, we saw Macron and Keir Starmer at the Arc de Triomphe this week, standing together, going down the Champs-Elysees in a sort of open-top Jeep together. This was very much a symbolic way of saying, Britain and France, we are standing side by side. And, it was quite a big symbolic act, that, I think.
Well, and Philippe, Macron, or not Macron himself, but France will face an election soon again for the presidency. I do wonder how much Donald Trump's victory will kind of embolden the far right in France. Do you expect that at all? Will it help the Rassemblement National? Is Marine Le Pen even really a fan of Trump? How closely aligned are they?
She used to be a fan, and she was quite vocal about it. I think she toned it down following his defeat in 2020, and particularly following the events on the 6th of January 2021.
Because I always find that interesting, right? She has not been somebody who has ever suggested election interference. That has not been part of her rhetoric. She's accepted the results of elections.
No. I think there's every reason for Le Pen to like Trump, his politics and policies. But I think the style is a bit too much, because the whole strategy of Marine Le Pen has been to de-demonize a party, a brand, appearance. And that's, of course, a break with what her father, Jean-Marie, used to do. Jean-Marie Le Pen was very Trumpian in his personality, very brash, very loud, also using all kinds of rhetoric, including sexist, racist. She doesn't want to do that at all. So I think that's why probably Trump at some point became a bit of an embarrassment. But now that he's won again, probably in a run-up to the French election, which will happen normally in 2027, but who knows, there might be sort of an early election if Macron, for some reason, has to depart, then probably, yes, it's good news for Marine Le Pen, that election, clearly, because I think the style, probably she will stay away from it, but I think the policies, I think to a large extent, are very much in line with what she promotes in France.
Terry, just very quickly, in the UK, do we imagine that this is more of a problem within the Conservatives, with the new Conservative leadership and Nigel Farage?
I think for the Conservatives, it's interesting. I think it was really strange that Kemi Badenoch, the new Conservative leader, chose her first Prime Minister's questions as leader to start saying, well, Keir Starmer, will you be inviting Donald Trump to, to speak to both houses of Parliament? Because plenty of people on her own benches would not want to come and see Donald Trump, address both houses of Parliament. It was a strange one to do, because most British voters, whether Labour or Conservative, are not necessarily big Trump fans. And I think more generally, it tends to, a better tactic is to say, we would like to work with you on these international issues. How can we cooperate, with the government on that one? It was a strange choice.
Terry Stiatsny and Philippe Marlière, thank you for just the moment. In this year of democratic elections around the world, although each race has of course been dominated by its own internal dynamics, when you zoom out, there is a pretty clear trend. It's being called the curse of the incumbent, as country after country has kicked out their ruling parties, whether left or right, and voted for the opposition. Mauritius is the latest example to join the trend this week, its own prime minister having just conceded defeat earlier. One man who's been running the numbers is John Burn-Murdoch, chief data reporter for the Financial Times, and joins us now to discuss a little bit of this. John, great to have you on the show. What have you found out from crunching the numbers?
Sure, thanks for having me. This one, I think, is just really important to put the last week's US election in this context, which is that for about 120 years now, data has been collected on what has happened to incumbent governments in elections around the developed world. And every single year, up until this year, at least one incumbent government party in one of these countries has gained support at the polls. So that's a party that was already in power. Voters clearly felt it was doing at least a decent job, and so it increased its vote share. In 2024, for the first time since this data was ever recorded, that is not the case. And every government in a major developed country around the world that has gone to the polls this year has been punished. That doesn't necessarily mean they were booted completely out of power, but they have received a lower share of the vote than they did at the previous time. So it's just an indication that this has been an incredibly tough year for incumbents. We've had inflation, we've had the pandemic in recent memory. And so it was an enormous steep uphill battle for any incumbent to do well this year.
It is, of course, a steep uphill battle, as you say. What's interesting, I suppose, is that it doesn't probably help for politicians to actually point to any of these international trends and say, well, inflation was not my fault. Look at other countries. I mean, is that something? What do you make of that? How politicians will try to kind of lean into, maybe, should they lean into this international trend?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? So all of the data we have suggests that there is very little that any country or any government could have done about inflation, right? This was a global supply chain disruption off the back of the pandemic. You then had the Russia-Ukraine war. Adding to that, particularly in Europe, there's really not much that countries could have done differently to avoid this. And on some level, at least some voters, I think, are aware of that. But at the same time, every day they go to the shops or buy something online, they're hit with a higher sticker price than they were used to. And they just think, well, look, this is painful. I'm in this country. This is my government. I don't think they're doing a good job of handling it. So, yeah, I think it's been incredibly difficult for incumbents to either policy or messaging to combat this. But at the same time, yeah, I think despite being true, it would not be politically effective for governments to simply come out and say, look, this isn't our fault.
And John, just one other aspect of this. I mean, do you get any sense, can you say from the data about why this is happening besides the economics? Are voters just angry? Are they more impatient than they used to be, given that they sort of, just want to boot out incumbents quite quickly? What kind of reasons can you give for this trend?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, one other thing that I think is potentially a factor here, a smaller factor, but a factor nonetheless, is immigration. We've seen in the UK election, in the French election, in the US election, immigration has been very high up the list of issues that voters have said are concerning them as they go to the polls. And if you look at the data, that's not entirely without some basis in fact. Immigration rates to all sorts of Western countries have been either at or close to record highs in the last couple of years. So I think that's possibly one factor as well. But, there may be some longer term issues here. The economic growth that any given country is experiencing, has been lower, sort of structurally lower for the last couple of decades compared to what it used to be many decades ago. And I think that just means the sort of positive vibes that come from the sense that things are getting better, that used to characterize most of the developed world, have just weakened a lot, and so it makes it easier for frustrations, whether these are global frustrations, as it were, or national ones, to come through and lead to incumbents taking a hit.
John Burn-Murdoch, Chief Data Reporter for the Financial Times. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's bring back in our panel, Terry Stiatsny and Philippe Marlière. Philippe, France obviously is in an anti-establishment mood. We saw that in the last election, and as we were mentioning, there will be presidential elections. Is there anything that you think can halt this trend if it is indeed a global one, as we were just talking about? What does Macron need to do in the next couple of years to maybe try and change the trend?
It's going to be difficult because it seems to me when it comes to France, for instance, the curse of the incumbent is a well-entrenched trend. Macron did well because he won 2 presidential elections, won 1 general election and another one as well, so 2 in fact. He lost the 3rd one with this sort of snap election. But however, in general, I think the trend, and I think it's beyond France, it's quite something. I think politics has been changing. I think political scientists have shown that in their research. You know, the pace of politics has increased. People are more connected, access information more easily, 24/7, and everyone has an opinion about things. Probably the opinion is formed more easily, undone more easily as well. The realignments in politics are more dramatic than in the past. There's a sort of slump in a sort of partisan loyalty. Before, when you used to vote for a party, it was almost for life. Now it's over. So all these things together, and on top of it, of course, if the government is not doing particularly well with the economy, of course, that's a decisive factor. But I think just look at the recent US election, there isn't one particular factor which would explain Trump's victory. I think there are several of various nature. And it's more and more difficult for political scientists and pollsters to predict election outcomes for that reason, because it's more shifty, and also public's opinion is more moody. It's more, it changes all the time. So I think we're in probably for a long period of where incumbents will lose. When I was studying politics, there was, we were talking about the honeymoon period of a new government, which at the time would last at least a year. For a year, the government would be popular, would surf on the wave, could do anything, it would be still popular. Look at the polls already for Keir Starmer, they're not that great.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, Terry. It does feel like there is no such thing as a honeymoon anymore. The mood is already souring on Keir Starmer. Our vote is just growing more impatient.
Yes, and I think, the incumbency factor in Britain, certainly at the last election, was complicated because we'd had, Conservative governments for 14 years, but within that we'd had 5 different prime ministers. So there was a way of kind of saying, oh no, it wasn't me, it was the last guy, or the last prime minister who was there for 6 or 7 weeks, in the case of Liz Truss. And so, there were some changes. So you could kind of say, look, we're renewing ourselves like sort of Doctor Who or something. But I think one of the bigger problems is, as John was referring to, is this sense that people think, I'm not progressing in my life. I can't move to a bigger house or get a new car or whatever it is. My living standards haven't increased for, about that amount of time, for a really long time. And I think particularly in this country, Keir Starmer said he wants to have more growth. He wants to kind of renew the infrastructure. But I think after the pandemic, there was generally a sense in this country that a lot of the problems that were there became more obvious, problems with the health service, problems with the infrastructure generally, the railways, things like that. And those kind of things, they do affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis, but they're also really difficult to solve without a lot of reform and a lot of investment and a lot of, trying to go through the process and saying what actually makes this country work better.
Well, let's turn now to a conundrum that we have covered a couple of times on this show before, but for which cities continue to come up with novel solutions. Overtourism is the scourge of the world's most popular destinations, and this week in Italy, Pompeii has decided to cap the number of visitors to its ancient ruins, while the Vatican is offering AI-driven services at St. Peter's Basilica, hoping that at least some people might be tempted by the offering to avoid the real thing. Philippe, do we buy this AI thing? I mean, one way to look at this, I suppose, was, were you at all ever wowed by the virtual offerings in the pandemic? Because that's sort of what this reminded me of. It's just like an extra step beyond that.
During the pandemic, I would have said yes to that because we were all stuck at home.
We had no choice.
Choice. But no, if you were offering me now the AI visit of the Vatican, a place I've visited several times, but still, I wouldn't accept it. I think you have to see the real thing in person. This said, I understand the problem. It's a real conundrum because there are clearly places in the world, not so many, but some places which are overcrowded, and that's a real problem to visit the place. And that's also, you can tell that too many people there at the same time can damage the place, particularly if it has a historic wealth and so I was, for instance, personally, I was in Rome, one of my favorite cities, last spring, and I was really shocked because I hadn't been there for 10 years, and going back there, I didn't recognize the historic center. It was so overcrowded, and it was so dirty. And it was a circus. It was absolutely unpleasant. So I could understand. I think Venice and Barcelona have already taken steps to limit but it's difficult. You can do that more easily for a museum. So probably the waiting list would be longer. You won't be able to visit the museum when you decide it. You have to plan ahead, which is always a bit of a difficulty. But why not? But limiting the number of people who can go to a public place outdoor, that's a bit of a difficult thing, but I see cities already doing it.
Well, and I suppose Pompeii is a museum of sorts, being an ancient ruin. But Terry, I mean, are there places like that for you as well? I mean, aside from the impact it has on the place, I mean, I was in Delphi, visiting the Oracle of Delphi earlier this year, and I mean, I had, almost a claustrophobia from the amount of tourists that were there. Have you ever felt that way? Are there places that you go to or that you purposely avoid and would rather maybe see
certainly
an AI
I
version
think in terms of places like Pompeii, one of the things they need to do is just up their game in terms of the technology. I mean, if you go to an art gallery, as Philippe was saying, you're going to get a timed ticket for a popular exhibition. They say you turn up at 10:30. If you're booking a ticket for Pompeii, you can turn up anytime. So maybe they just need to get a bit better tech that says, right, you're coming at 9 and you're coming at 10 and so on. But as you're saying, limiting the numbers of people in public spaces is really hard, but I think you need almost like a fast lane and a slow lane. I was in Edinburgh recently, and the impact of Harry Potter is unbelievable. So there's one street which looks a bit like Diagon Alley, and everybody is stopping, everybody is doing their selfies, everybody's doing little videos and things like that. It's just like, move along. People who actually want to go somewhere can go on the left, and people who are stopping for photos on the right. And the same in sort of Piccadilly in London when they turn the Christmas lights and the Christmas windows on. They're just people standing crazy. Absolutely still. It's like, keep moving. Just keep everybody moving, I think.
That sort of reminds me of New York and people looking up at the skyscrapers in the middle of the street. But I will, before we go, just one other question. I will perhaps flip it on its head. I wonder, not that I want either of you to give away your personal secrets, as it were, but are there places where you have visited that you've been surprised that there weren't more tourists, particularly beautiful spots that have not caught the tourist's eye?
Oh, I suppose, I've been travelling around a lot of university cities in the UK lately, looking for kids sort of applying to university. And there are some beautiful places. Durham is pretty much, it's got a beautiful castle, beautiful cathedral, amazing. Really, apart from students, not that many people visiting. So like the northeast of England has got some amazing historic sites, but with not as many people there as, say, Edinburgh.
Philippe?
Yes, there's a famous city everyone knows, I guess, where if you go there in the middle of the summer, on the 15th of August exactly, it's almost empty. It's Paris. The reason being is that all Parisians go out and leave the city at that time. That's very well known. At 15th of August, the city will empty. Of course, you will find still the masses of tourism, but if you empty the city of all the Parisians, that makes a big difference.
Does that mean you should go to the places that are not touristy?
I love going to Paris on the
15th.
I love going to Paris on the 15th of August.
Terry Stiatsny and Philippe Marlière, thank you very much for joining us. And to wrap up today's show, we dive into this year's Turin Art Week, where artist and writer Sofia Hallström spoke to the directors of art galleries Pinacoteca Agnelli and Castello di Rivoli about their latest artistic offerings.
Turin Art Week, held citywide in late October, is a key event in the international art calendar. My first stop is the Pinoteca Agnelli, where I meet with director and curator Sarah Kozulich. We walk along the Pista 500, the former Fiat test track on the Lingotto rooftop, redesigned by Renzo Piano. Our conversation begins with Pinoteca's permanent collection and how it connects to the building's architecture. We then turn to the current exhibition, Arrivare in Tempo, Arriving on Time, a major retrospective by the late artist Salvo.
Together with the curatorial team, we started thinking about the legacy of this collection and at the same time the opportunity to connect it to the history of the building, because we are placed on top of what used to be the famous Lingotto Fiat car factory, a building that is still a kind of masterpiece of architecture, industrial archaeology. It was really a utopian building where cars were being produced. It was built in the 20s. Cars were being produced and were tested on the roof, on this truck, on top of the roof, and then they were going down from this very special ramp. So it's a big legacy about work, production.
And onto the show at the moment, the Salvo show. The exhibition spans the breadth of Salvo's career, from his more conceptual works to his dedicated exploration of painting. What was your curatorial approach to the show and presenting the continuity between his different phases? And what do you hope audiences will take away about his relevance today?
Yes, this exhibition by Salvo is situated within a program dedicated to pioneer artists that are bridging the past with the present. And in particular, Salvo is an exhibition that is relevant and much needed. He's a figure that strongly belongs to the art scene in Torino. He lived in Torino most of his life, coming from Sicily. He was part of very close to the Arte Povera movement. He was a conceptual artist at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s. He was very much in touch with everybody, a close friend of Boetti, and he's an artist that all of a sudden in 73 started painting, so moved away from the conceptual language, apparently, let's say, and started painting. And I think the objective of the exhibition, as his paintings now are becoming more and more successfully seen by the public, although he was not a figure that was much known for a while, at least internationally, although in Italy he was much recognized and he had collectors, he had shows, actually even abroad, but still it's a figure that needs to be contextualized. His work needs to be contextualized within those years and within the conceptual movement. So our approach, myself and Lucrezia Calabro-Visconti, we curated the show, is really to present this immense body of work in sense of paintings that he started in 73 until his death in 2015 as a continuation of his conceptual language. Our approach is really on focusing on this repetition of subject matter to really emphasize how his painting, although about light, color, because they are quite stunning, and in effect we presented them a lot together. So we wanted to show this repetition as a really key element in a philosophical, art historical, true conceptual approach.
Next, I visit Castello di Rivoli, a restored 17th century castle that once housed the House of Savoy. There I speak with director Francesco Manaculda to discuss his first curatorial project here, Mutual Aid, Art in Collaboration with Nature. This group exhibition addresses sustainability and challenges viewers to rethink their relationship with the natural world, emphasizing cooperation over competition as a key to survival.
The museum is about to become 40 in a few weeks. It was opened in December 1984. And it was really the first museum completely dedicated to contemporary art in Italy. The museum is located in a Baroque castle, which was in fact unfinished and was never completely built by the royal family here in Piedmont. The design originally was by Philippe, a very prominent architect in the 18th century. But halfway through the construction, the family ran into financial difficulties and interrupted the building site. And although the building itself would have been twice as big and was not completed, the families then started renovating and finishing the part that was already built and started living in it. So there's this sense of unfinished project, which in fact is also very interesting and corresponding to famous art movement that emerged from Turin in the 60s and 70s, arte povera, a movement that really investigated the notion of the unfinished gesture or the energy trapped inside materials.
I want to ask you a bit about the concept of mutual aid and how this philosophical foundation informs the exhibition and how the artworks engage with this idea.
We started thinking about this show because of this collection of essays that Piotr Kropotkin wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, and he was really trying to demonstrate, and he does it by using a number of examples, that both inside a single species and then also between species, collaboration is actually leading to the advancement of the survival and the sort of evolutionary potential of each species involved in the collaboration. So he wasn't really doing this in order to demonstrate that Darwin was wrong. He was saying like Darwin is right, but he's right that competition and the survival of the fittest works perfectly when there is an abundance of resource and a stability of the system. When these two conditions are not positively, abundance and stability are not there, then only collaboration between species can allow the system to evolve altogether and therefore increasing the probability of individual species survival.
The exhibition as well challenges the traditional separation between nature and culture. Can you discuss how the artworks blur the lines between human and non-human agency?
I would say pretty much all the artworks are started by humans and completed by non-humans in different ways. So there's different degrees of collaboration and different open areas that are left to the non-human collaborator. But all of them have a different way in which the human doesn't finish and the natural element finishes the work. And that is what creates this sort of prototypical kind of relationship.
That was Sophia Hallström at Turin Art Week. And that's all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panelists today, Terry Stiatsny and Philippe Marlière. Thanks also to John Burn-Murdoch of the FT. Today's show was produced by Vincent McAvinney and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Germani. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Chris Termack here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.